Is it just overly romanticized, this idea of heritage varieties?
A little bit, yes. But the
Do you get embarrassed talking about that
well, come
success?
on, let's talk about the subject. When we say peat-free, what do we really mean peat-free? And this is, I think, is quite important for people to take on board an acceptance of a very small volume.
And what's that like now?
It's one.
It's just Frank P Matthews.
Yes, it is. And
So you're just sandwiched in the middle, really.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Is there a place that you visited that combines both trees and livestock that has interested you?
I would think they're a very bad mix.
Really?
Yes.
What, trees and livestock?
Yes.
Interesting.
Okay, so
what do you think the future landscape for fruit production in the UK looks like from your perspective?
Is this just for agroforestry or for fruit production in general?
We could start in general,
yeah,
and then we could explore the agroforestry. Yeah,
right. I think in general, it's, the commercial side of fruit production, and I only know about what we call top fruit, tree fruit, is I think currently in the balance as economically viable, despite I think professional fruit growers having an extraordinary skill level to produce very high yields at very low prices for the supermarkets, and so they're pretty well drilled down to a very tight margin, and they persist and they do a very fine job. Now, every other level of fruit production, if you go into organics, maybe into agroforestry and so on, it's all at a slightly different level that perhaps enables the grower to have a higher premium, probably not with agroforestry because it's linked to environmental benefits as well. But I think that it's a very good question because for somebody like myself who's been involved with the commercial fruit industry for over 50 years, I've seen a general decline in growers' fortunes in that whole.
Could you maybe like scope that out then over like the 50 years from like what you remember as a young adult to kind of like now? What's that decline been like, and has it been like, is it like speeding up now, or is it starting to plateau? Or
I think it's leveling off a little bit. I think growers have got some amazing knowledge and tools at their disposal to get high yields with very good modern high yielding varieties. That's the key. I'm particularly talking about apple and pear production. I would imagine that would be similar in soft fruit actually as well, which is very professional. But if you start when I began with my working career, which would have been in the early 70s, growers were getting a fair price for their fruit, considering the inputs. And we were still, in some ways, had a legacy of support from the government for planting grants, grubbing grants. We went through one phase, we went from one end to the other. We went from a grubbing grant to a planting grant inside of 2 years.
Didn't something similar happen with hedgerows as well? There's like a grant to clear hedgerows, and now they're like grants to plant them back again.
Well, quite possibly. There were. I mean, if you go back to after the war, this all stems from a shortage of food. So it was correctly supported by government after the war because everybody was hungry, and then gradually the support was removed. We also went into the EU, so there were no tariffs on imports. So you can see what happened over a gradual period. It became not a gentleman's living, but it became a professional living over a period of about 20 years, where production had to become very much on a professional footing with all the necessary agronomic support and modern equipment, modern cold storage, all these things developed at the same time. But it didn't make actually the growers' fortunes any better with all the, because they were losing support more than they were gaining it in other areas.
Sounds like me in school, really. The older you get, the less support, the more you're out into the real world.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I don't think anyone's complained. I think we've all just got on with it. And you could say that runs a parallel with the price of trees. We've had to get more and more competitive with our tree production going to fruit growers than we used to. And so that's become, it's all relative.
Do you just mean that more just because there's a greater quantity of nurseries supplying now? Is that what you mean by?
From the UK perspective, much less.
Much less.
When I started my career, we had about 6 or 7 commercial fruit tree nurseries in the UK supplying fruit growers.
And what's that like now?
It's one.
It's just Frank P Matthews.
Yes, it is.
Wow.
Yeah. There's lots of imports.
Yeah.
Through agencies and various things that go on. And we are limiting our production to plums, cider and a few dessert. But we also have a partner's nursery in Holland and Belgium, Holland and Germany, to fill the gaps of varieties we don't have a license to grow. So we do it. We cooperate with nurseries on the EU.
And does that link into what you were saying about needing high-yielding modern varieties?
Yes.
But you obviously, with plant breeders' rights and stuff, you've had to adapt and rely on other nurseries to collaborate with in order to maintain business in a way, whereas everyone else has dropped off. So, what do you think is different about the approach of Frank P Matthews that means that it's still very much a strong brand and still got its footing in this industry?
I think our extreme interest in the subject and our enthusiasm for it, because we started to work with breeders. We've worked with 2 breeders in the UK of apples starting in the early 90s. And that has helped us introduce new varieties, keep us very focused on the top fruit subject. And we've also propagated rootstocks here on site, which is we produce parts of the tree as well as the trees themselves. If you're in a nursery business, you can buy in propagation wood, you can buy in rootstocks, but we've always maintained production levels of both those things to contribute to the economics of producing trees.
So in a way, having too many stages, you're controlling as much as possible, and that is what has allowed you, rather than putting dependence on external sources.
Correct.
And I know a big thing as well that is probably testament to the attitude is how it was about 15 years ago moved away from peat-free compost, which kind of 15 years ago, that happened before it kind of came trendy, because I feel a lot of people just do it because they need to pretend that they care. But obviously 15 years ago, there wasn't the social media pressures of peat-free. So what drew that change?
Well, up to this point, we've only spoken about bare root field production, but you're quite right to talk about container production, which is mostly trees that go to the garden centre industry and to online businesses and so on. So we started to produce most of our trees in peat-free. We started the journey about 12 years ago. And I think it was partly environmental interest and conscience, a little bit, but we also saw some advantages. The physical nature of peat-free is actually quite more user-friendly in mechanisation of potting and so on. And we also have an abundance of water here on the nursery, because peat-free requires a lot more water use than peat substrate.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And we'll probably go into the more of the different avenues a bit later, but I think the thing that I found interesting when you're talking about the current climate for fruit production in the UK, looking at those high yielding modern varieties and like the margins getting squeezed, that sounds like parallels across the whole food industry, be it milk or vegetables or anything. It just seems like a categorical thing. I've yet to find really a kind of an agricultural or food production niche that has gone the other way. It feels like it's always the race to the bottom. And
Yeah.
I think I want to get your personal opinion on this, because at the moment there's this line between kind of the whole like economic side, which is essential, but then trying to find something where you've got your own unique selling point. And I know a really big thing at the moment, and getting increasingly bigger, even in like the veg gardening world, are heritage varieties. And I want to know from you is like, do you think there's too much emphasis on breeding new varieties all the time, trying to compete for maximum production, versus growing the heritage varieties we already have? Or is it a case that we need to be doing both? Because, you know, there's a March's Apple Network, which are doing really important work there with retaining these heritage varieties. And sometimes I wonder, like when I'm in the garden, there's some hybrids that I grow that are great, but I can't save those seeds, but I grow them for specific characteristics. But when it comes to things like taste or something, like there's some heritage tomatoes I'll be growing every year because I feel they're unmatched. And would you, where do you stand on that?
Well,
or is it just overly romanticized, this idea of heritage varieties?
A little bit, yes. But the two subjects are very wide apart, and it's getting wider. If you go down the commercial, there is a very good reason why they're breeding bulletproof fruit without flavour. It just comes, when they talk about quality of modern apple varieties, for example, they very rarely ever use the word flavour. They will use crisp, they will use sweet. They don't use the really interesting adjectives which were so important with when you're eating.
Like honey or something.
Yes. We've got a host of varieties we're breeding currently which have amazing flavours. Everything from aniseed to vanilla to pineapple, general citrus. You could name any flavour from any other fruit was now being incorporated into some of the apples that we're breeding. But going back to your question about heritage, there's some very good heritage varieties, but most of them do not retain shelf life. They have no shelf life. A few, yes, but they're either lacking yield, they either don't have very good flavour. It's a myth that heritage varieties all have good flavour. Some of them taste like turnips. They're a complete waste of time on the table.
Well, so are turnips, aren't they?
But genetically, they're really important. Now, all that is being very well catered for in the UK, around the country and different regions. You mentioned the Marcha Apple Network. That's very active in this area, and we actually assist them in preserving all their genetic material. We have a collection here propagated and established as a charitable contribution to their work, because we think it's really important. If you go to the east of England, there's a very active group, East of England fruit group. There's the Northern fruit group. All over the country now in the last 20-25 years, ever since a very important date where Common Ground launched the first Apple Day in around 1995 is when it all started, and we should be indebted to that organisation for raising the profile of old varieties which were being lost because they weren't being catered for in the private garden, and they weren't being catered for in commercial growing because they were limiting the varieties grown, and that has obviously been accentuated recently. So the two things are very separate, and they're both being catered for very well. New breeding in that sphere, and then heritage varieties being preserved. You've only got to go to the National Fruit Collections in Kent. There are 2,500 varieties of apple established there, and they've always been there. 1,700 are native, the rest of them are from other parts of the world, and it's growing. We now have a register of local cultivars, which has come about in the last few years, all on the back of being able to DNA material that's coming out of hedgerows. You know, when you travel down the road and you see apples on the side of the road.
So that a few times on my way here.
Okay, I'm sure you have, especially
I nearly stopped and had a snack. I was like getting a bit peckish.
People chucking cores out the window, and seedlings grow. People will go and find them, and they'll get them DNA'd as unique. And once they're established unique, they can go in front of a panel of experts, and they will give them the nod for quality. And then so they'll go on to the register of local cultivars. That's fantastic work. It's all voluntary.
Have you discovered an apple?
Yes and no. We actually invite amateurs to give us their varieties that we put under trial. We don't charge for it because we're interested in all the genetic diversity of material. So I would think that we've got at least 10 varieties a year that go into trial from amateurs, as well as our own breeding as well. So it all goes alongside each other for a sort of an equal assessment of certain criteria: appearance, flavour, ease of growing, cropping, tree shape, disease resistance, which is all important. We're very focused on scab and mildew disease resistance in all varieties now that come our way, be it from the amateur field or from professional. It's very important.
No, it certainly sounds it. Have you read Dan Barber's Third Plate?
I've started it.
Have you?
Only started. Yeah.
Because when you were saying about bulletproof fruits without flavour, it reminded me of one of the stories in that book, which is one that's always stuck with me, about a vegetable breeder, I believe, in the US, and the story was that he wanted a butternut squash that tasted good, and he went to the breeder and said, I want it to taste like this, this, and this. And the breeder was like, in all of my life of breeding, I've never once been asked to breed for flavour. Which, like, that I heard that story, and that was really interesting. And so what kind of breeding work are you doing here? Is it then more for the flavour, or are you trying to just cater for the bulletproof fruit without flavour?
Well, I suppose in an ideal world,
or you kind of do it both.
It would be both.
But is it an ideal world?
No, it's not. But we're putting flavour before anything.
Right, flavour first.
We've got
Sounds
to
like
find
a political campaign.
user-friendly varieties with flavour, but flavour is the first criteria.
What kind of process do you go around deciding which flavour is superior?
Parentage.
Parentage?
Everything comes from parentage.
Right. Yeah. So it's not down to subjective taste, where you get 10, people off the street and say, which is your favourite apple? And then you're like, we're going to breed this one.
Well, that makes it interesting, because everyone will taste any food slightly differently at certain times of day, following what else they've eaten or drunk, their propensity to pick up flavours. Some people can taste flavours more acutely than others, and I'm not an expert on that, but I'm sure you would agree that is quite possible. You have professional wine tasters; they have certain palates that are very sensitive, and other people have very little taste, and that's how they're born. It's all how you're born with your own genetics to pick up on the genetics of flavour.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be quite a fun job, wouldn't it? Just like testing apple varieties instead of like a wine connoisseur. I think the thing that stands out to me as a kid, because when I was about 1 or 2, there's a photo of me in a pram, and my dad, who on Saturday became a trustee for March's Apple Network, planted this orchard of around 30 different apple trees, and it's just me in a pram and my dad planting these trees. And I grew up with them, and they're all kind of like, it's kind of weird because I'm 25 and all these trees are quite big and got like moss and lichen growing on them and everything, but there was one tree that stands out the most during my childhood, and it was a Pitmaston pineapple. And I think it stood out to me as a kid because of that flavour of being like, oh, I didn't realise that you could have this thing that would taste like something else. And is there a particular couple of varieties that for someone who has like a smaller garden and are really interested in a flavour that is unique or they could never buy elsewhere, that you're quite passionate about apple wise?
I think it was one of the reasons why we introduced Scrumptious, which was from our first breeder we worked with in the 90s. I think we introduced it in the year 2000 actually, and that was, we put it out to a lot of people for tasting, and we came back with an extraordinary amount of obviously good comment, but the amount of different flavours that were just other people picked up on, it was fascinating. So we had honey, we had cherry, tropical notes, all sorts of things that people came back. So we knew there was a complexity there. There was a general crowd pleaser in terms of flavours. So that sort of kicked us off in going down this pursuit of looking for different flavours. Yeah.
So as well as Scrumptious, is there another variety that maybe you personally, with your unique flavour palette and a certain time of day, really like?
Well, actually, if you go back to one of the, I wouldn't call it quite heritage, maybe early 20th century, Ellison's orange. It's renowned for its aniseed flavour, and you'll have that in various apples. Aniseed is prevalent. It's an acquired taste. Parma violets,
right, yeah,
is a particular flavour of apples.
Yeah,
that some people really like and other people don't like it. So it's a real it divides people, yeah, in their like and dislike, and you'll find other flavours as similar to that. Yeah,
that's really cool. What is a heritage variety then?
Anything over 100 years old.
Anything over 100 years old.
That's my definition. I think is the right one.
So say like a recent one, I think, is the diamond apple that my dad has grown, and I think there was apparently some shipwreck or something that along the story that goes, and then they got some scions and grafted it, but I think that's over 100 years. But if it was like, say, an 80-year-old tree and that was a mother tree, it wouldn't be heritage yet. But would it mean in 2044 it would then be heritage because it hits 100 years? Is that basically is it a very simple?
Well, I think it's the right one. I mean, others may disagree.
Well, they shouldn't, because you have, what is it again? You have an RHS Victoria Medal of Honour. So if anyone disagrees with you, they're wrong.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Let's move on, shall we?
Do you get embarrassed talking about that success?
Come on, let's talk about the subject.
Well, I think it's testament. People need to think, why should I really believe this this man I'm chatting to? And I'm also interested in the individual, because for someone to spend so much, like basically your whole working life, was it you were 22 when you started here at Frank P Matthews. And was it your granddad who...
Oh, my grandfather was Frank Matthews, so my maternal grandfather.
Yeah.
Now, my father was Andrew Dunn, and actually he was a VMH holder as well.
No way.
Now, father...
What for? What for? Like, what's it?
All the work he did with the development of mostly virus-free fruit trees in the 60s and 70s. But he was a very fine nurseryman. He was, I completely idolized him. He was a wonderful man.
So it was destiny for you in a way to get into
yes.
this.
I mean, when I was 8 years old, he gave me a sharp knife and get me to prepare budwood with him, propagation material. And that's how I fell in love with it, like you when you were growing up.
Yeah.
I know a little bit about you as well, you. So we come from a similar background of just being entirely consumed by a subject that is become very dear to us, and we just love the subject, don't we?
And the thing is that the subject is so great and vast. What are the specific areas that is what you really specialize in or geek about in the world of trees?
Well, everything started with fruit trees. From when I was growing up, I studied agriculture and fruit growing at college, and then when I came back and joined my father, he was already growing some ornamentals. We were doing crab apples, malus and prunus, and when we started to put trees in pots for garden centres, we realised we had an opportunity to do the whole range, mostly of deciduous trees, which included ornamentals from aces to zelkovas. So that's how we developed the supply chain into garden centres. We wanted to do as broad a range as possible, because within that, the wider the range you handle, the more knowledgeable you become, and the more gaps you fill in when it comes to people wanting certain trees in certain criteria. It could be a flower type, or extension of autumn colour in leaf, size of tree, form, upright forms. It's when we went into ornamentals, it was like opening up a whole new world to me in terms of tree type and knowledge. And it was every step we took broadened my knowledge and led me down another path into different trees. And it just happened naturally.
Well, it sounds very organic in its growth.
Organic is the right word.
Like, obviously, if you got started kind of, well, probably even before 8, but was it, with all the knowledge from your father then going to agricultural college, were there some parts where you're like, oh no, that's wrong? Or was it quite interesting having like learned from your father and then going and learning from professors?
Yes, it was. Yeah, I actually wanted to study more about the soil.
Okay.
Because I knew I would come back to join my father in the nursery, so I needed to broaden my outlook. So that's why I studied agriculture. So I did my fair share. We used to have cattle here, beef cattle.
Yeah.
There was my father's manure factory. My grandfather was actually quite an organic, principled nurseryman. He used a lot of organic material on his nursery, just outside Heathrow.
Oh, right.
And that became natural. So we learnt. My father learnt from my grandfather, and I've learnt from both of them.
Mm-hmm.
So we had them until it became completely untenable commercially, financially. We had a herd of beef cattle that made manure.
So would you say that like manure and the growing of particularly of top fruit is a good match in heaven? Like, if you were to say plant an apple tree, would you recommend, if it's poor soil, that I incorporate some organic manure into it?
Yes.
And how much? Like a wheelbarrow? Or?
Well, no, you've got to be a little bit careful. You need well rotted manure. and that means that lends us into ordinary mulching, composting process and so on. But most composts actually lack nitrogen. Nitrogen is very important for growth, for extension growth, for vegetative growth. So most composts need to be amended with some sort of NPK feed. And nitrogen is often neglected, I feel. So if you mix manure with your compost in a sort of 50-50, well-rotted manure with compost, you naturally offer slow-release nitrogen, which is so important for the establishment of trees. So you need to preserve moisture, but you need to add organic matter, and manure or animal manure of all types makes a very, very useful additive.
I'm going to be a bit selfish here because I've got loads more apple trees to plant, especially this winter. What would you say, going straight to basics, is what's like your favourite way or recommended way that is most like broadly usable for planting an apple tree?
Are you talking about the ground preparation?
Yeah, kind of step by step. I brought a bare root apple.
Okay.
And I want to put it in the ground. How do I make sure like it gets off to it becomes a strong tree? My end goal is a strong, productive apple tree.
Yeah.
But at the moment I have a bare root. So what do I do?
Okay. The first thing you do is you do a little bit of root pruning.
Mm-hmm.
You put it in a bucket of water for about 6 hours, or a tank of water, and then if it's lost some moisture on the way to you, which is it's possible, then you recharge the tree with moisture, number one. Secondly, you've got to have to dig a hole.
You mentioned root pruning though, sorry.
Pruning.
What do you mean by that? Like just snip off the tips?
You just prune the roots. If you dig a hole and then the roots are too big, you can quite happily prune roots. Most people don't realise that.
Right.
It's actually an advantage for two reasons. When you prune the roots and put it in water, you've opened up the vascular system, so it immediately takes water up. You then, when you plant it, it's wet and it's going straight into a hole, and you backfill straight away. And one of the most important things in the first year or two is that tree around its base, for maybe 1/2 meter around circumference, radius 1/2 meter, no competition from grass. Grass is the biggest problem for newly planted trees. It saps the moisture out of the tree in the first year or two, and the tree will sit there and put on no extension growth for several years if it's got competition with grass. The other thing you need to do is, because the roots have been broken during lifting and a little bit of root pruning, you want to prune the tree back. So you need to cut the branches back by 1/3 immediately after planting, and this compensates for the root pruning, and then it will encourage extension growth in first year. No competition. You can do a bit of mulching around the top, use anything that's relatively inert if you wish to. It doesn't have to have a lot of feed, but trapping in moisture, no grass competition, pruning back the tree, it will force some extension growth, and the tree will actually make better anchorage because you've done some root pruning as well, because you're forcing young roots out closer to the tree, and it forms a better anchorage.
And so say if someone is watching this and they planted a tree and some grass is growing around it, would you recommend that they take the turf off?
Yes.
And not like mulch over the top, actually take the turf off?
Okay, sorry. If you go back to stage one when you're digging the hole, if you're doing grass, you take the top part 2 inches away and remove it. We used to say you could turn it upside down, and that's fine, but as long as you watch what happens to that upturned turf. whether it starts to produce grass straight away, and that can happen.
Yeah.
But if you remove it, put it into your compost heap, and then just replace what would have been there in mulch with an organic mulch, then you that's the best solution.
Thank you. That's really cool. Another big thing that people talk about is square hole versus rounded hole.
Square every time.
Square every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this limits, it stops the roots going round in a circle. Because if you dig a round hole, it's a bit like a bucket effect, particularly with heavy soil. All you do is the roots come to it and they start going round and they follow the contours of the hole. So I would always go for square.
Good.
It stops, it traps the roots into the corner. He's mopping his brow.
No, it's good. That was just to make sure I was doing the right thing.
That must have been a very nervous question.
You know what? Like there's no growth in comfort. No. So
good, well done.
One of the things that because we'll move into agroforestry a little bit, but one of the things that I want to hear from you, because I'm also interested in the ornamental side, and a big interest of mine is ornamental, so things that can kind of cover both categories, like some varieties of crabapple. But in terms of the ornamentals and all the ornamental trees you added to the nursery over the years, what are perhaps the varieties that made the biggest impact, or you're most proud of introducing and then supplying to gardeners across the UK? Yes,
that's a good one. We introduced Bachelor Dorenbos under a marketing name called Snow Queen, and it was such a fine white stem birch. It's in the Utilis family. It's related closely to Jacomontii, Utilis, and we were frustrated because this was the finest white birch. It certainly from the youngest tree would turn white at the youngest tree of the form of Utilis. We were so frustrated that nobody would plant it because they couldn't even pronounce Dorenbos, let alone understand what it meant. So we gave it a marketing name. And this became, because of that, it actually became, and still is, our most popular ornamental tree.
And you think the success is down to just the marketing of that name? Wow. Yeah. And actually that reminds me, I need you to clear something up for me, because I was at Chelsea Flower Show this year, and there was this Starlight prunus, and I saw on your social media that you were celebrating a Frank P Matthews tree, but I didn't see the Frank P Matthews logo, and I wanted to know, at the Chelsea Flower Show there was a different nursery or something. I wanted to know how so the connection there.
Yeah, the Chelsea Plant of the Year show I think has been running for about 15 years, maybe more, and the rules are that you can't enter the tree. You have to put the tree on your stand at Chelsea.
Right.
We've never exhibited.
So you didn't have a stand.
So we had to find somebody else who would put our tree on their stand.
I bet they were pleased that you asked them.
Yes, it was quite good, really. Yeah, but we've had to do this before.
Right.
Peter Seabrook helped us on several occasions on the Sun garden that he used to do. We always used to put our entry, and this is the first time we've actually won it. Yeah.
What did that feel like?
That was great. It was a nice surprise.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is a very fine variety. Now that's actually was bred by a man called Ken Tabat and his colleague Radovan Bošković, who both are woody plant breeders. They do a lot of prunus, flowering prunus, and one or two other things like sambucus. Ken bred all the ornamental sambucus that came out of East Malling when he was a breeder for East Malling in many years ago. He's a very good breeder of woody plants. So we work with him, and we work with other breeders as well who would like to use us as a route to market for their breeding. And that's how it works. It's all about people working with each other.
Yeah. Do you, does a nursery, have you looked into eucalyptus?
I don't know very much about eucalyptus.
Because this is something that I have seen gaining interest in the agroforestry sphere, particularly in the UK, because there are many varieties available, and looking at biomass production, it looks, whilst it is not a native, there's a whole different discussion about why maybe people need to get off their high horse about only grow native plants, because they'll realise there's not really much left. But I think that, because again, this is a selfish question, but I'm looking at my site and I've been exploring different things like Italian alder, for example, and looking at windbreak options. But there's some really interesting eucalyptus species that I've seen some other projects beginning to utilize. And in terms of producing wood and fuel, that's very exciting. And yeah, I was just wondering if that was on your radar, and if you what it would take for you to look into breeding eucalyptus.
Well, I think that before we talk about eucalyptus, I think you've hit your nail on the head on one thing, which is we should be embracing the possibility of planting non-native trees, naturalized, of course, non-native in as much as we may need them.
Yeah.
And some of them are extraordinarily useful and climate resilient for planting in the UK climate. We have one of the best climates in the world for growing woody plants, for growing plants in general, with the Gulf Stream influence and the sort of the zone that we're in. It allows us to grow a very, very wide range of plant material. So if you walk into any established arboretum in this country, most of which are over 100 years old, you will find and observe trees that have come from all over the world that are very, very happy sitting in our climate. The proof is there. The trial has been going on for over 100 years, thanks to plant hunters, the people that went around the world, particularly to China, to bring in plant material. It's already there, and we can make observations. And most of the woody plant people I know agree with this. We all think our palette for trees should be as broad as possible, and then we will find out what's really useful.
Because I used to be a bit of maybe a purist in that sense, and thinking as like native and as heritage as possible. But when looking at how can we produce resilient or like regenerative food systems, there's a lot of gaps missing in our native group of plants for specific ecosystem functions, or functions that we really need, whether it's really quick growing biomass or certain types of windbreaks, or even like some of them are there's a lot of like really beneficial things even with wildlife. And what's quite interesting is I think it's all down to climate, because something like Eleagnus or autumn olive is an invasive in a lot of parts of the US. And I've got a really good friend, James Reed, up at Tappernothe permaculture farm in Aberdeenshire, and he's planted Eleagnus and it's doing really well, and people are commenting on his videos from America like, don't grow that, it's invasive. And it's shown like no invasive, because it's kind of like where you put the plant. And I think people are rightfully worried about invasive plants like Japanese knotweed, but again, they're growing they grow really well because there's an opportunity. So it's trying.
Plants are opportunists.
Yeah, yeah. So it's trying to like find that balance. But I got put off with eucalyptus before with, I think, having like just less biological, like wildlife benefits. But in terms of biomass, whether for chop and drop or syntropic systems, or producing fuel, or really fast growing shelter belts, so then the apple trees that I'm planting will be more protective. It's actually looking at the whole rather than scrutinizing every individual thing. And it's like, you don't tick enough boxes for me. It's more nuanced.
I think we should mix trees as much as possible. One thing we should get away from is monocropping, that's for sure. So, I mean, agroforestry is a wonderful opportunity to start to put in different species, genera, all in one area. If you wanted to keep it simple, you'd put eucalyptus down one row, you'd put, I don't know, tulip trees down another one, which is a good resilient tree. There's lots of them, and you might even want to mix down the row as well, as long as there's a logical reason why you would do it. So you're looking after competition, so the trees don't compete with each other. They're given space, allocated space, light, air. It's all important, but I mean, if a biomass production is very key to for one reason for doing it, but if you I'll be a little bit controversial here. One of the fastest growing trees for biomass is actually the Sitka spruce, and it was chosen for a very good reason. The problem was we put it everywhere, in blocks, you know, and in forestry, and that is nature and other plant diversity has suffered in any monocropping situation. So that was one example of it. It's a very good tree in its own right. It shouldn't be discounted.
So do you think Sitka spruce is almost an unknown, or in terms of looking at agroforestry systems in the UK, serves quite a cool opportunity that maybe people are a little bit afraid to explore?
It's possible, yes. I'm just being a little bit controversial.
That's fine. I appreciate it. It helps
because I think we've got to look at things in much broader picture rather than being too tunnel vision about this. But if you want a tree that produces biomass at a big high rate, then Sitka spruce happens to be one of them.
Yeah.
What you do with it is different. It's obviously important, but that's just trying to put things in perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. What is agroforestry to people that don't know?
Agroforestry is the planting of rows of woody plants, trees, in parallel rows, with leaving a sufficient space for agriculture use between the rows. Now that might be combine widths. Could be 6 combine widths or 10 combine widths and so on. I don't know if there's any defined spacing for these rows, but what you're doing is you're stopping soil erosion, you're introducing nature into agriculture by breaking up the agricultural fields. It's a bit like putting hedges wide apart. I think there shouldn't be too much of a single definition of agroforestry, not in my mind. I'm sure an agroforestry expert will tell you, well, actually, it's this specifically. But I think it should be a fairly broadly conceived idea. Yeah,
and
a movable feast, if you like.
Yeah, and sometimes it's nice to have that open definition to give the creativity, especially because every farm is different, has its own needs. I know it's a popular technique in France, especially on the combine scale, and I think integrating more trees for timber production as well in between. But what are some of the most interesting agroforestry projects you've come across or visited in the UK?
Well, we started to supply trees fairly early on, about 15 years ago, for agroforestry, and it's taken quite a while to get going. but in the last 2 years, we've started to get supply some pretty serious projects. Ironically, the biggest one we've supplied is to a dairy farm that used to milk 800 cows a day.
Wow.
And the farmer, after doing it for 40 years, had needed a break. And
no way.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And he's embraced it, and it's a farm in Nottinghamshire.
Right.
Yeah, unbelievable.
But is that taking all stock off the land, or is it?
Yes.
It is really.
Yeah, it stopped milking his last cow about 2 months ago.
So what's his system now? His agroforestry system? What's he changing to?
He's mostly planting apple trees because he wants to crop. Apples are probably one of the most successful fruit to put into agroforestry. They're quite productive. They're good for pollinators. You've got a whole variation of types of apple, from cider production, dessert, cookers, juicing varieties. So he's mixing all these, and he's doing a few pears as well, and some plums and cherries, walnuts, but they're in the smaller proportion because he's more comfortable initially with apples, because it's an easier crop to grow. If you're starting off into a whole new enterprise of top fruit, you would start with apples and then you would migrate into more difficult fruit.
And is he doing anything in between the rows?
I'm not sure what he's doing between the rows. We haven't had that conversation. I should imagine he's growing some cereals, some vegetables. It'd probably be on a rotation as well. Yeah.
Interesting. What about a system that is a place that you visited that combines both trees and livestock that has interested you?
I would think they're a very bad mix.
Really?
Yes.
What? Trees and livestock?
Yes.
Interesting.
Okay, so if you go back to when mankind first planted the domestic orchard,
right, they
used to do it in a very logical 2 or 3 generation period. So they would plant the apple. If we just take apples, for example, they plant an apple tree. After about 15 years, they would have chickens under it for the first 10 years. Then they would thin it out, and they would have sheep under for the next 10 years.
Right.
And after 20 to 25 years, they would do the final thinning to what we now perceive and know as standard trees, at standard spacing.
Yeah.
And then they would allow the cattle in. But they would never allow the cattle in until the trees were 25 years old.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So my father would always say to customers, he says, whatever you do, don't ever allow horses into your tree paddock, because they will eat them. Because horses they can stretch higher than anything. But you have to give trees time to establish their canopy above the feeding mouths of animals. So you had to do it that way.
But what about like a system where you're doing tree rows, like I forget the name of the farm. It's the one with organic farm with Ben Raskin.
Okay, you're talking about fencing or electrical fencing.
Yeah.
It's completely different.
Yeah.
But you have to fence down
both
sides of each row in agroforestry if you're going to stop animals eating the trees.
So there's a case for if someone, because I'm just like thinking of different concepts here. If someone wanted to get started with an agroforestry row and didn't want to, or with agroforestry, the potential is chickens.
Yes.
To begin with in the establishing phase.
Yeah.
What about like geese?
Yes, that'd be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a little bit more destructive.
What about
than
pygmy
chickens.
goats, because they're quite small?
Goats?
No, pygmy.
Oh, pygmy. Pygmy goats.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure you're
Could you
right.
do like a...
Yes. But you want to know your animals before you put them in with trees.
Yeah.
You want to know their habits, what the mischief they can get up to, and that's as long as you take that into account, you're fine.
Yeah.
But you inevitably, if you want to let animals in early, you've got a fence, and that's costly.
It is.
Very costly.
And a bit of a headache as well.
Yeah. And you still got to monitor it. How many times have I known, in the days when we used to have hard winters, we'd all go on a Christmas break and we'd come back and a lot of the trees have been eaten by rabbits because we didn't go patrolling the fences during Christmas time, and they would get through the fence and eat the apple trees.
But they're really tasty rabbits, though.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. So another thing that I think there's a lot of interest at the moment is nuts. Do you think people are getting a bit nuts over nuts, so to speak?
Yes, they are. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Hazel and walnuts are the most popular to plant.
Yeah.
You can mix the two, but
Okay.
most people either plant walnuts or hazelnuts at their respective spacing. It's actually surprised me how successful walnuts look to be for our climate.
You mean yield-wise?
Yield-wise and value-wise, yes. And inevitably you've got to deal with squirrels. And the best way is to planting the walnut trees in isolation with wide headlands, because squirrels don't like to go over open ground.
Okay.
They get a bit nervous.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
So if you plant walnut trees if you create wildlife corridors, you're attracting squirrels into.
Oh no! Don't tell the conservationists that.
Well, that is the reality of trying to produce walnuts for food. Yeah.
So squirrels in Britain can get through a walnut.
Yes.
That's really frustrating. Yeah, because that's always been my concern. Because I've grown up on a small holding with quite a few hazelnuts, and it was always the day before you're like, okay, I'm going to harvest them all tomorrow. They look great. As soon as you do that, they're just stripped by squirrels. And it's quite funny because when I was down in Devon, I visited Martin Crawford, and I was asking him because he's big on nuts.
Yes, he's very good.
And he said, well, one of the things that you can do with pests like squirrels is to look at how they could also be a yield, like completely seriously as well. Because if you're gonna fatten up, maybe squirrel will be back on the menu. With the amount of walnuts going.
I think I have eaten a squirrel.
It's a bit like chicken.
When I was younger.
Yeah.
Yes, it's palatable.
But in all seriousness, do you think there is like potential with walnuts here in the UK?
Yes.
And would you say Broadview is the most popular?
It's the most popular because it is self-fertile. There's one other, Buccaneer's, partly self-fertile. The best quality nuts are usually Lara and Frankette, in my opinion. Those two we would certainly recommend with Broadview in commercial plantings. Fernet and Fenor are two others, and Chandler. Chandler is only recently being planted. If you go to California, to one of the main walnut growing areas of the world, it's pretty well 95% Chandler.
Right.
Across the whole of the walnut growing area.
Oh, right, okay.
But so we need to check that Chandler does actually perform in the UK. Early signs are quite good.
What does that mean?
Means it seems to be setting some nuts on young trees. You've got to remember, walnuts really don't get into cropping till about year 8 or 9. So you have to be patient.
Yeah, that's hard sometimes though.
It is hard to be patient.
It's harder than walnuts themselves.
But you know, the flavour of homegrown walnuts is so superior to what you buy in packets.
Never had one.
You never had them?
No. Have you got any here?
You're missing something here. No, the wretched squirrels, I nearly
really?
I nearly used a four-letter word, but the wretched squirrels took most of all our hours this year. Yeah, but I've had moments of good harvest, and I usually crack them when I'm watching the TV in the evenings, and dry them in the airing cupboard.
Yeah.
And the flavour is fantastic, absolutely so different. They're very bitter when you buy commercially produced walnuts in packets.
Really, yeah.
They're actually quite bitter compared with homegrown.
Oh,
yeah.
I just thought that's what walnuts were, a bit bitter, you know.
No.
Well, that's promising. Squirrels less so, but you know.
Yes.
What do you think is like the biggest thing holding back wider adoption for agroforestry in the UK?
I think you have to accept that we need financial support to make agroforestry work. There are grants now, and it's helping, and it's making a difference. Whether it could ever be a standalone economical production system for agriculture, I can't answer that question. But it certainly needs financial assistance and support from the government to make it work.
You said something earlier about how you saw a lot of shift happen when obviously it entered the EU and the market, and then it was no tariffs, and then apples coming in from elsewhere. Do you think, regardless of what your opinion is about Brexit and not, do you think at least there is an opportunity for the UK to take food production more kind of seriously? Or because my perspective is like the government never really seems to talk about it much and doesn't really seem to have much interest in self-sufficiency as a nation.
No, I think they don't take food security seriously enough. I think it's a big issue, and I'm afraid politicians don't view it as important. I can, maybe you can tell me why that's the case.
Oh, because they're so out of touch.
I'm nodding away.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think it's a very sexy thing to talk about, food.
Well, it should. Maybe. It should be, you know, because if the lorries stopped rolling, the supermarket shelves would be empty in 3 days.
Well, we saw that during COVID, didn't we?
Yes, and it could happen again. So, but we also need the public support and understanding about the value of homegrown food. Now, it may cost a little bit more because it has to, because we're in an inferior climate to maybe Southern Europe, Mediterranean, other parts of the world where production costs are much lower. So it's easy to import, pick up the phone and import the next lorry load of whatever food to come in. But we need to take our own homegrown seriously and support it. I want to get back to, we were talking about peat-free.
Yes.
Can I mention something about that?
Go for it.
I think it's although we are 85% peat-free in terms of our compost or our growing media that we use, there is an issue which is important, which is what we call legacy peat. Now, this is a very small proportion of many plants that are produced are started off in peat because it's the most successful propagation medium we have. I'm not talking about just us. I'm talking about the industry itself. I'm talking about being compatible with EU producers who are very good at propagation. So a lot of when we say peat-free, what do we really mean peat-free? And this is, I think, is quite important for people to take on board, an acceptance of a very small volume, smallest volume of peat that might be in a plant that is grown on to finish to retail time, that we should accept, I think, certainly up until 2030, when we have the government's potential band-aid, that we should be accepting of legacy peat until that final peat-free date is forecast, which for the government it's 2030.
So is legacy, is that like, if you're doing a little plug plant, is that the only time when peat is used? Is
yes,
that what you mean?
in a lot of plants.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the way that I see it, it's like kind of just stripping it back to the start. If you're growing a tree and it just needs like that much peat, and you think about the amount of carbon or goodness that that tree can provide in whatever that is in terms of local food production, biodiversity things, I do think, like, I'm in the gardening world and I think people just have too much time on their hands, and I totally understand where they're coming from peat wise, but it's kind of weird because I didn't even realize peat was a thing until I was about 17 or 18. I thought it was like a brand of compost, you know, like John Innes. I was like, you have John Innes and you have peat. But
yes, that's a good point.
because I just use a lot of manure, to be honest, and I think it's a bit different with vegetables. But I know as well there's for certain dredging of canals and stuff is another source of peat that is happening anyway. What's the best alternative to peat?
There's lots of them, and there's lots of good work going on and research to find alternatives. But of course, all the alternatives have their own carbon footprint, and we ignore that, and we seem to give peat a bad time. But actually, we're chopping down trees. To most of our compost is either coir. Most of it's recycled coir, but it's coir that's come from the other side of the world. We're chopping down trees and stripping bark to make bark composts, and those are the two main ingredients, but they don't come without some cost to the environment. And we seem to, we're being a little unfair on a renewable resource, which peat is actually.
Renewable?
It is. If you stop harvesting, it'll renew itself within so many hundreds of years.
Well, true, but you could say oil is renewable, couldn't you, if it's like over 1,000 years?
Oh, it's a much longer process. But anyway,
I get what you mean.
But I'm only talking from a professional perspective. I'm not talking about what people should do in their gardens, and I'm not preaching. I'm just trying to protect commercial or horticulture,
because they're going to get, and they do get, a lot of flack and
yes, we do
from the public.
And also, the quality of our plants is not 100%. We will get penalised at the market if our and sometimes.
So you're just sandwiched in the middle, really.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Probably quite a tasty sandwich, really, with all the fruits that you guys offer. But still, what do you like?
Anyway, that was just one. That was just one thing I wanted to put some perspective into peat-free, which is nearly peat-free.
Is there maybe anything else that people that don't know how the nursery industry works that you think would be quite cool to share?
Yes, I wish that was probably the only question I would like to have had in advance.
No can do.
No can do.
I don't have the TARDIS with me today.
Right, okay. Yeah. I think if you take the amount of skill, effort, physical work that is required from people that work in horticulture, I think it's underestimated and undervalued. The amount of discomfort we put ourselves through to produce a plant or anything that relies on the weather. So the risks that we put ourselves at because of weather influences and environmental influences. And I think we should, horticulturalists and all that, certainly those that work here are highly valued for their skill level and their determination and energy. And
is it hard to find those workers?
It's difficult.
What is it? Is it because people are like, oh no? Is it difficult because it's seen as undervalued, or is it difficult because there's a skill shortage, or if you found the right person, are you happy to train them up? Like what are you looking for?
It's difficult for the two reasons you mentioned, and yes, we are prepared to train people over many years to bring them up to a not only just a physical skill level, but a knowledge of the subject as well. All our staff here are homegrown. I think we've only got one horticultural qualification in 85 people that work here.
Really?
Yes.
And is that your RHS Victoria Medal?
No, I'm not including myself. It may be two, but
so
this is significant.
No, that is huge though. So like, they don't have any horticultural qualifications.
No.
And that goes against the grain of the status quo of anything really. Yeah. It's like,
yes.
So they haven't done their RHS level 2s?
No.
What? Blasphemy.
But it's not. It has not had a negative effect on our business.
I think that's really promising and encouraging. But also, and I think I know that there are some businesses who rather hire someone who hasn't gone to uni versus who has gone to uni and learnt about that specific degree, but it's because it's mindset, I think.
Yes.
Because if you haven't gone to uni, you're probably a bit more open, and then you can kind of mold them to the person you want in terms of for the business, rather than trying to, retrain an old dog.
Yeah. Well, we used to take, some years ago, we used to take 3 or 4 parties of students around every year. We're now down to 1. And
is that students from a college? Or
yes, from colleges. We always used to, but they don't seem to be interested so much now. And I think it's to do with the curriculum. The curriculum is not focused specifically on very, very particular subjects. So there is no interest in the horticultural educational world to come and visit an operation like us. Now, maybe we're doing something wrong here, but they're conspicuous by their absence.
I wonder if part of it is like, when you go into something, you have no idea what it is, you have no context on which to appreciate something. So you're kind of like, they're kind of going around and they just don't really know, like, it's like the first time for a lot of people seeing anything like it, which is probably, because of the curriculum in it.
Anyway, that's just my observation. I can't tell you how to put it right.
Does it upset you?
No, not really.
No.
I mean, we've given opportunity to young people from our local area, and we're very grateful for them turning up and sticking with us. Yeah, we value them highly.
Because it's, I remember when I first came for a walk around, and there are loads of, you have like different teams. I don't know if they call that the grafters, and that is, it's not like grafting as in like hard work, even though they were doing hard work, but they were literally grafting fruit trees. Because there's that saying like, oh yeah, he's a grafter, isn't he? And in Frank P Matthews, literally are grafters. But they're working like.
But our job, and similarly with other horticultural operations, it's a very skillful job. It's very technical. It requires many years' experience to get to know all the aspects of it, and we have a lot of IT involvement. We've got a lot of technology. There's agronomy. You could learn all about the agronomy of the business. I mean, it's fascinating all the skills that are involved in producing one tree is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's quite a cool system to see. Though my only concern with what you said there about maybe one college coming around and just not being as interested and harder to find is, like, Frank P Matthews is a heritage company and probably part of what you're thinking, and I know it's very much still a family business, so to speak, but thinking about the next 100 years and trying to maintain those skills and interest, do you think there might have to be something that you do differently to employ people?
We probably changed a lot of things we've done in the last 40, 50 years to adapt to our situation today, and we will have to continue to be changing everything we do.
That's why it's still around.
Yeah.
Frank, you're funny. So I think coming to the last few questions, one of the things that I am interested in, and this is maybe more like business wise or what opportunities that you see, is you kind of serve a lot of different sectors, such as like the home gardener, to the garden centre, to the landscaper, to the farmer. Is there any areas or opportunities that you feel as a brand you're maybe underserving or feel an opportunity to serve that you aren't currently yet, or building up for that?
I think we are very interested in it's touching on one thing we've already mentioned, which is developing knowledge of trees that will be good for climate change, and have more knowledge and more experience, more knowledge on how to propagate them, whether it's from seed or from vegetative propagation or whatever, how to grow them successfully, and how to impart knowledge to our customers that will be just around the corner for that particular subject. So that's one thing that we're just starting to look at.
What kind of things does that involve? Because that sounds quite exciting.
Yes.
So what are the kind of things that you're doing around that?
We're into the 4th year of helping the RHS as a partner research into garden trees in urban situations which are environmentally friendly. This could be to do with flood mitigation, absorbing pollution particles, trees that are better for pollinators, resilience, carbon offsetting, and so on. But in terms of smaller trees, they all have a purpose as well. So we're just starting the 4th and final year of a research project. So the findings will be of use, obviously, to us to select and maybe focus a little bit more on some of the trees we didn't know was servicing in the environment better that we weren't aware of. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
That is interesting. Yes. Yeah.
So will those is that findings that the RHS will then share, or is it more of a joint secretive project between you two?
We will be sharing that information. Yes.
Yeah, and then conveniently people can get the trees from you. I mean, it's in your own best interest to share it.
Yes.
And I want to, because that's what I'm trying to think is, what are things that I can plant, or what opportunities? And I do think viticulture is getting kind of exciting. Well, I find it very exciting. But are there any fruits that are perhaps on the more unusual or more unknown sides, that for someone that is listening that is a little bit maybe of a maverick or loves experimenting, that you think it would be worth a punt to trial growing in a agroforestry system, even if the market doesn't yet exist for that fruit, or misunderstood, just in terms of growing well in our climate?
Yes, I think there's one or two. I mean, some have already been tried. Almonds is one. It's never going to produce a lot of fruit in our current climate, but they have been trialled. We were talking about nuts. We could extend, and you've spoken to Martin Crawford, he'll probably know more about this than I would, but we're keen to try heart nuts as the next step from walnuts. We think heart nuts might be viable, and some of the other nuts are less so, but eventually, coupled with breeding and selection work, we might actually find hardier versions of persimmons, fruit like that.
Is work being done for that?
It's probably. I think I could say yes.
Yeah.
There is.
Yeah.
I think that all breeders will always be trying to breed plant material, fruiting plants, which are more resilient than they have been in the past. It may be higher frost resistance, self-fertility to help better yields, so you don't have to have pollinators. A lot of this is in the hands of conventional breeders, and some of it's very exciting. If you delve into one particular subject, you will find people that are very advanced in their field, but they may not have found that ultimate goal yet, but they're not far off. So yeah, we're watching all those things which are of interest to us. Yeah.
What is the thing that excites you most about the next 10 years in the world of trees?
I think the potential for planting trees in more wider situations. More wider genetic material that will challenge areas where trees can be planted in different soils, wider climates. I think it's an endless opportunity. I don't think I've expressed myself very well.
You're just excited about it already,
yes, yeah.
And you're allowed to say that.
Yes.
Because I don't make the rules.
Okay.
That was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
That's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.